graphics before we, oh, okay, whatever.
It will be fine.
Uh,
It always kind of just auto encodes. So if it doesn't work, it doesn't. You're not going to make it work.
I'm going to turn my video off except for when I'm speaking, if that's cool.
Okay, let me just see if it's.
It will be fine. It always kind of. That's
cool. Okay, I think it's working. Okay, let me just see if it's. Okay, I think we're good to go, Ellie, whenever you're ready.
All right, sure, let's get started. So welcome everyone to the 2021 Online Easters demo debate. I'm Ellie. I'm going to be chairing this debate and I'm also going to be DCing the tournament. So you may see more of me later. The affirmative tonight will consist of first speaker Hameed, second speaker Leah, and third speaker Apratim. And then the negative will consist of first speaker Shruti, second speaker Jeremiah, and third speaker Jess. The topic we'll be debating tonight is that we prefer a world where co-parenting is primarily non-romantic. And then in brackets, we've got conducted by consenting partners who have no romantic or sexual relationship, for example, friends. So to begin the debate, I'd like to introduce the first affirmative speaker, Hameed, who has been a DAV Debate Open winner, UNSW Pre-Australs Grand Finalist, and was also the Melbourne IV Open Best Speaker. Welcome, Hameed.
Hey, can everyone hear me? Just like
yeah,
thumbs up if you can. Okay. Hey, my name's Hameed. Before I start my speech in earnest, I just want to say that due to the nature of this motion, there's some like sensitive subject matter to some might be discussed. So a lot of talk about like, you know, divorce or unhealthy child raising environments. If this is something you don't want to see, something you feel uncomfortable watching, it's totally fine, no big deal. Just thought I'd let you all know. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. I don't know about you guys, but as a child, I've never really been that fussed about my dad's sex life, you know? Like, it's never really mattered that much to me. It's never really been incredibly important. What is important to me is that I have a relationship with someone in my life who took care of me at a young age. I have a relationship that's healthy, that's good for me. I get some sense of stability and support out of my family. That's all that really matters. I've never really been that fussed about like whether or not my mom and dad are fulfilled within their own romantic relationships. And I think that's kind of a universally relatable idea, and it's one that we're going to be discussing more later. This speech is going to talk about 3 major things. Firstly, like just what this kind of looks like and how this changes the decision-making process for potential parents. Secondly, we're going to be talking about how the child raising environment is better on our side than in the comparative. And then thirdly, we're going to be just talking about how this is actually better for the parents involved as well, which I think isn't, you know, as important, not as important as the life of the child in this debate. It's probably the most important thing. I think both teams are likely to agree on that. But I do think whether or not the parents are happy and fulfilled, 1 has inherent benefits, but 2 has trickle-down effects. Okay, so firstly, what do these kinds of relationships look like? They really just mean co-parenting. You're not romantically involved, but you are both equally as invested within the child. We're likely to talk about this beforehand, discuss it. And a lot of the times, these relationships, as they currently exist, have conversations around them. As in, you have boundaries, you have a division of obligations and responsibilities. And it's important to realize that these kinds of co-parenting situations actually occur under the status quo in a lot of different ways. They just occur in ways that are slightly more normalized, i.e. within the family context. So co-parenting between step-parents, right? Like dividing between the time between them, but also other kinds of co-parenting circumstances, like when children are raised in equal part by their parents and their grandparents, or by their parents and their uncle or aunties, where you go to them on the weekend, or you go to their house after school and they take care of you because the parents are busy at work. These kinds of relationships exist. It's just only within a very minor set of people that we deem as being eligible for this kind of co-parenting dynamic. And it often is like additional to an existing one, but it exists under the status quo. Our world is only different in that these kinds of relationships exist with people outside of your family, but also are the norm rather than a subset of circumstances. So firstly, why this changes the decision-making process for potential parents for the better. It's important to realize that the way you choose the person you marry isn't the best process for choosing the person who's going to be the parent of your child. But under the status quo, you are doing both of these things at the same time. More often than not, you're picking the person you're going to marry, and then because you want to marry them, they are going to be the parent of your child. What's the alternative here? The alternative is that these are separate decisions that you make within your life. You pick one person to be your romantic source of fulfillment, and you pick the other one to be your co-parent. Why is this better than the status quo? For two major reasons. Firstly, it's just that going into this, you're more likely to have a sophisticated vetting process, right? Maybe not sophisticated, but definitely more than just, oh, they have a really hot face and they sometimes make me laugh, therefore they're going to be the father of my child, you know? Like here, it's like you're more likely to be more restrictive with who you choose to be your co-parent, likely to be someone you've known for a long time as well, maybe a childhood friend, maybe someone you have a intimate relationship with and you know each other well and you trust each other a lot, just not in that romantic sense. It could also be, you're also more likely to vet for things like financial stability, or you're more likely to, I don't know, see their experience, see how they are with other children and make your decision based on that. Whereas you don't really decide who you're going to marry, who you're going to be in a romantic relationship with based on these same qualities to the fullest extent. And this naturally leads to a better household environment for the child, which I'll talk about later. Secondly, we also get less kind of like rushed pregnancies or rushed marriages, right? And under the status quo, there is a tendency to kind of rush things along and just pray that it works out in the end. This is because, firstly, there is a societal pressure involved in terms of the age that you get married and the age that you have children, etc. But this societal expectation is likely to exist on both sides, so whatever. But the other thing is this kind of like the conversations we have around the biological clock. This means that women are more likely to force themselves into a relationship or really push themselves to get married and have children before the age of 30. The fact that both of these decisions are interlinked has harmful consequences, which I'll talk about later. Okay, so finally, I'm going to get to that. Argument number 2, why the child raising environment is better. So at a fundamental level, what do children really need? They need, number 1, they need attention and love, time and care, that kind of stuff. Number 2 also is that they need stability. Just that, you know, if a child is misbehaving, a lot of times psychs point out the lack of stability in their lives as the reason why. The relationship between the parents at this point isn't really that important for the child. What's most important is the relationship that the child has with each of their parents. And the important thing to note here is that under both sides, these relationships are likely to be almost exactly the same. Why is that? Well, first of all, when you have a child, to have a sense, you go into that, and especially under our side, where you're more restrictive on whether or not you go into a childlike you have a child in your life, you're likely to take into that with a huge sense of personal responsibility because it's a decision you've made and thought about. So you're likely to care a lot about that child. Secondly, it's that the child is like an extension of yourself and is a huge part of your identity, and you're likely to put a lot of time and value into it. But thirdly, just like natural instinct, of course you're going to care about your children, whether or not you're romantically involved with their other parent. It really doesn't matter. We don't think it matters that much. What is important is this comparison. In our world, the entire family unit is centered around the needs of the children rather than being split between the children and the parents. Under the status quo, the family unit exists primarily, well, firstly, the relationship between the two spouses involved, and then the child comes along as a product / consequence of that dynamic. Whereas in our world, the child is the center of that dynamic. It is where that dynamic begins and it's where it ends and it's where it's all about. Why is this important? Is because, first of all, in the status quo, you're much more likely to get a lot of really bad separations. Why is that? It's because when the person who you're raising your child with also has to be the person who completely fulfills your life and is the love of your life, when that love fades, you're more likely to want to separate, which has harmful consequences for the children. This issue ultimately stems from the idea, like I flagged at the beginning of my speech, that you're making this decision at the same time, that this has to be the same person doing both of these roles in society. In our world, you can just move on, or this isn't really an issue you have to face with in the first place. Secondly, it's that toxic relationships are more likely to persist under the status quo, because even though the person you're with is, could be harmful for you, you don't want to separate because you don't want to hurt the kids. Finally, how this leads to more fulfilling lives for the parents. And I think this is really important. And the basic idea here is that you are free to find romantic fulfillment in other people. That means that, you know, you can just live a life that is more happy for you. And I think by extension, you're more likely to have a supportive child raising environment. It's important to realize that in relationships, you need a level of spontaneity, but within a family dynamic, stability is everything. Everything gets compromised in order to keep the family dynamic as stable as possible. Consequences of that are you ultimately ending up being unfulfilled in a lot of circumstances, which ties into what I said earlier about separations. So because of that, I'm very proud to propose.
Thanks very much for that speech. Now I'd like to introduce the first negative speaker, Shruti, who's a third-year law student from India. Her interests outside of debating are theatre, politics, and BuzzFeed quizzes. And she's recently won King's College London IV, was the 10th best judge in Asia in 2020, and will be judging the HWS round robin this weekend. Welcome, Shruti.
Hi, confirming that I'm audible?
Yeah, you are.
All right, great. Just give me a second. All right, we're good to go. A few things first. I think we agree with the metric that side proposition sets out. I think the center of this debate should still be which side is best able to give these children a sense of stability in their life, probably a healthier relationship with their parents. I think on that we agree, but I think that's where all of the agreement ends. I think when affirmative chooses to argue that you make two uniquely different choices in your life in terms of who you're marrying and who you want to have a child with, I don't think that's objectively true. We think if you're compounding those decisions together, you're more likely to go ahead and make better decisions in your life. I'm not sure as to why when you're choosing who you want to marry, you only care about how attractive they are or whether or not they laugh at your jokes. We think you're more likely to go ahead and marry somebody with whom your ideologies are more likely to match, with whom you go ahead and share a better value system. We think these are the individuals who are more likely to go ahead and get married into strictly because of the societal narratives that exist around marriage. These are individuals you want to build your life with. We think even if we take affirmative at their absolute best case, i.e. people start making these decisions separately, we're not sure why making these decisions separately is an a priori good. Why are we supposed to assume that now when individuals probably make more flippant decisions about who they decide to get married to because, hey, they're not going to have a child with them anyway, why is that in total a good for society? We're not sure. Those are not impacts that they go ahead and ground for you, right? We think outside of that, it becomes incredibly important that even if we do go ahead and deem that what they say is absolutely correct, we think marriages in general become more volatile. We think given that romantic relationships and monogamous relationships are likely to coexist on both sides of the house, we think if your child is living in a house where your marriage is falling apart because you made a flippant decision because you just found the other person hot and you married them anyway, we think if your marriage is falling apart within that same house, it has a negative impact upon your mental health. The child still sees those fights, even if that's not a fight between their parents, and we still think that has a negative impact on the child in general. The second thing that they argue about is that you probably care about your child on both sides of the house, given that you biologically go ahead and give birth to them. We think that's largely inexclusive. However, what changes on our side of the house is that given that you're also involved in a romantic relationship with the other parent, you're more likely to then not go ahead and up and leave. We think parenting in general can be an incredibly exhausting and arduous task, which truly tests relationships to their core, given that you don't just have an investment in the child, but in also ensuring that the family at large stays together, because there is also a romantic relationship at stake. We just think that there is a greater investment within the relationship at large. Also, to quickly point out like a small case contradiction that exists, if they want to argue that in a romantic relationship, you don't prioritize the child and the romantic relationship is the priority, in the same breath, they cannot go ahead and argue to you that these individuals continue to stay in a relationship because they don't want the child to go to see a divorce or to see a split. If married couples only care about their relationship or constantly put it first, then these individuals will probably not stay in toxic or abusive relationships and probably break up or get a divorce. If they do in fact go ahead and put their children first, that co-opts into the benefit that side affirmative gives you, and we're unsure as to what then stands from their case. Our constructive case is as follows. We think raising a child is ridiculously exhausting. Children are objectively the worst. This involves having midnight diaper runs, ensuring that you're making sure the child is falling asleep on time, that the child is eating on time. We think it's an absolute nightmare for the mental health of the parents at large, right? Regardless of who is raising them. We think, given that this is a romantic partner that you might be raising the child with on our side of the house, you're more likely to stay invested because you don't really care that the child is wrecking your sleep cycle, because you're doing it with the person that you absolutely love the most in the world, and you have a vested interest in ensuring that they're better off and happy as well. And secondly, we think, given that there are legal ramifications that come with being married, it's just harder to get out of a marriage in general, which is why it's harder for individuals to just up and leave when they're in a romantic relationship with somebody and raising a child at the same time. Secondly, we think uncertainty for children is something that is likely to increase on the affirmative side. Why is that true? We think when you're working as a family unit, the challenges of parenting are not just limited to the needs of a child. We think it also involves, say, the financial needs of a household, essentially everything that you need to essentially ensure that a family is able to run functionally, right? We think, given that we live in a capitalist society, individuals really love the kind of money that they earn. So we think that when the parent who is perhaps living with the child is perhaps undergoing a financial crisis, the other parent doesn't see it as their responsibility to be able to sustain the entire family of the child that you're raising, the parent, like the entire family of the other co-parent, i.e. if you're in a different romantic relationship with your specific partner while also having a different co-parent who is perhaps your friend, we think financial difficulties are not seen as something that everybody has to resolve together, because everybody compartmentalizes their priorities in life, i.e. I will only do my bit to ensure that the child is okay, perhaps not much for the rest of the family that you may go ahead and have. We think that's inherently unhealthy because of the kind of tension that it leads to within the households, right? Thirdly, in the form of how romance and monogamy are going to exist on both sides of the house, we think on affirmative side of the house, individuals will still want to get married, they will still want to fall in love, they will still want to go ahead and have like monogamous relationships, right? And in that context, it is important to note that this is a third individual that you're introducing into the life of your child, and whether or not you like it, this individual is still going to have a significant influence in how the child is raised, given that it is incredibly likely that they will be living in the exact same house. We think this kind of setting also makes like romantic relationships just harder to sustain, because your romantic partner is now also deeply invested in an incredibly important relationship with somebody else. We think the fact that they've also had sexual intercourse with somebody else who is actively a part of your life now, constantly perhaps sees you on weekends, is raising a child with you, understands the ups and downs of your romantic partner's life perhaps better than you do, because you will never know what it's like to be a biological parent to the child that they're raising. It makes your romantic relationships more unstable, more uncertain at large, making a great number of people really unhappy in the kinds of lives that they live in. Secondly, we think if you want to have a child with your romantic partner, it creates really complicated dynamics within that particular house. If at all you do go ahead and even on the affirmative side of the house, choose to have another child with your romantic partner, we think the child that you had with, say, your friend is somebody that feels necessarily left out of the family structure. We think the biological relationship and the love for your child that is spoken of by affirmative is something that works both ways. So if your romantic partner and you feel a greater amount of love in general for the child that you gave birth to, your co-parent who doesn't necessarily live within the same house doesn't probably get to spend the same kind of time with their child, because they just like geographical differences. You have other priorities in life and you're trying to just get by life in general. We think it makes life harder for the child at large. We think it makes them feel neglected, and it makes them feel like they're not an important enough part of their relationship. We think you're still likely to go ahead and give a certain amount of priority to the romantic relationships that exist within your life, i.e. if you get married and have a child with somebody else, still, we don't think you go ahead and deprioritize your romantic partners in your life strictly because of the way that romance is portrayed in pop culture, societal narratives. We think those are structures which are incredibly hard to break out of. Given that now you have to split your prioritization in the form of time and resources, not just between your child and partner, but between your child, your romantic partner, and a co-parent that you have to go ahead and share responsibilities with, we think the kind of variables that now exist within these relationships and the kind of possibilities of tensions that might be created is also something that inherently increases. In the way that they argue toxicity and why that is likely to happen, we're unsure as to why that is inexclusive. We think you can still go ahead and have certain expectations from your co-parents. You can still go ahead and have certain beliefs that you would like to share with them. And if at all differences do arise in those cases, we think it's incredibly possible that those relationships eventually become toxic and abusive as well. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thanks a lot for that speech. Next up, we have Leah, who is from Macquarie University. She has a host of achievements as a speaker, including reaching the semi-finals of Easters back in 2019. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you, Ellie. Just to check that I am audible.
Yeah, all clear.
Also Messenger.
What was that?
Also Messenger, the group.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A lot of the contentions that First Negative has with the idea that it might actually be better to have a world where the norm was that majority of children were raised by parents who were not romantically involved in each other. The majority of her concerns are understandable if you have a mindset that is entrenched in the way that we have all been raised to understand relationships and to understand family units. However, there is a degree to which you have to understand that us as people and the world and society and its laws would adapt if it was in fact a world in which the norm was that people who co-parented were primarily not people who were romantically involved with each other. So when the First Negative speaker tells you things like, well, marriages are harder to get out of, marriages have more legalities around them that are likely to cause people to stay, marriages have a higher degree of investment in them, and romantic relationships have the highest degree of investment in them. Those arguments all fall down because the reason those relationships are what we believe have the highest degree of investment is because they are currently in the status quo tied to the most important thing that arguably a lot of us will ever do, which is raise the future generation, which is to have children. When we separate having children from those romantic relationships, I extremely question whether they will remain to be the most invested in relationships that we have within our lives. And that's what we're going to talk about in our case today. Firstly, dealing with a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, we hear that, well, when you get married, you're likely to marry someone who has matching ideologies with you because of the societal narrative that exists about marriage, making this person you marry the ideal person to raise a child with. So this is where we respond with our first point of substantive, which is that the decision-making process gets better in a world where these co-parenting decisions are non-romantic decisions. So why is that true? Well, she says, the First Negative says, look, if you match your ideologies with someone and you have a high degree of investment in that relationship, that equals a good commitment for a child. And that's exactly what we also believe in. However, we think that romantic relationships require more factors than a co-parenting relationship does, which means that you may trade off some factors such as attractiveness, similar age, similar, tastes in romantic activities, things like that. You might trade off your ideologies in some parts in order to have that. Note that romance is built on a surge of endorphins that you get when you see a particular person or interact with them that often is determined by really arbitrary things. Like we know that a lot of people have a romantic type that they know is extremely bad for them. We know that some people have a romantic likening for people who damage their lives, make it harder for them to progress in their careers and make it harder for them to be happy on the whole, but they still love that person. We think that you're more likely to trade off your ideology when you are subject to that biological release of romantic endorphins. When you remove that from the equation, that is the best opportunity for people to choose based on these matching ideologies that First Negative says are inherently necessary to relationship being good enough that we would ever subject a child to it. So in that, she sort of concedes that whoever can best get matching ideologies in this partnership gets the best ways of raising children. Secondly, we hear the idea that, well, marriage is going to become more volatile now because there's going to be a lot of jealousy involved. People are going to not really be able to achieve the same feeling of monogamy that they do in the status quo. And we think that this is actually true if people's mindsets never change to understand that you can have more than one significant relationship in your life. But actually, the huge benefit of our world is that you do. In our world, a co-parenting relationship and a romantic relationship and a healthy relationship with your child are all significant relationships that you can have which contribute to your life. It's a world where the idea of monogamy is not as important to people. And it's a world in which you're going to have more significant relationships. And we think this is better. It's better because people would learn to be less jealous and controlling, because it would become more normal that no people really just have a romantic partner and that's it. Like most people would have a romantic partner plus a co-parent plus a healthy child relationship, and people who opt out of having children would probably be more common as well and would just choose to engage in their romantic relationship, right? That's better because it means a whole host of things. It means firstly that when one of those relationships falls apart for any reason, everybody in the world is more likely to have a support network available to them to fall back on. It means that if you have a falling out with your romantic partner, your child's life and the life that raises that child will remain stable, which I'll talk about a little bit more in our second point of substantive. Finally, so finishing off with that issue, let's talk about raising the children, which was the second point of substantive we brought to you. We hear that it's, a nightmare for the mental health of parents, and that you need to be really like tied down in a marriage and invested in the relationship to stay, because children are such a nightmare to raise. We see an inherent problem here, right? So everybody is wanting to get married, wanting to have romances in their life. We hear this conceded from the negative team. They then say, well, having kids is a nightmare, and it's really important that people feel stuck in that situation so that they don't just bounce on the kid, right? What if we could separate the desire to have romance from the societal idea that if you have a long-term romance, you should have children? The thing that would happen then is the people who do have children are the ones who are willing to put up with changing nappies in the middle of the night, who have found a co-parent who they would be happy to go through that process with, who they would be happy to lose aspects of the relationship in order to prioritize that child. It means that we would benefit every single person who wants to get married or be in a committed romantic relationship, because we would be relieving the social pressure that currently acts upon those people, that tells them that because they're in that romantic relationship, they are inherently the type of unit who should somehow therefore be raising a child. So we think that we can also claim that there. Now, finally, onto this idea of romance and monogamy, I'd like to add some new substantive here. So importantly, we think that there are antithetical elements of romance which make it really hard to raise a child, because romance relies on a combination of surprise and stability. You need surprise to keep you interested and happy in the romance, but you also need stability in order to feel safe enough to stay with someone for a long period of time. Children, on the other hand, don't require the surprise element. They just require the stability. They require stability because it has been proven psychologically that children who feel they don't have the ability to understand or control their environment are far more likely to misbehave, are likely to do things like drop out of school, to become violent, a whole host of other things. So we think that if you are able to, in your personal life, pursue a romantic relationship that has that element of surprise, when you have a co-parenting arrangement in the background that's never going to change and be safe, you're more likely to receive a fulfilling romantic relationship, one that when you are done with it and you have grown beyond that person, you are able to move on without breaking the heart of a child who is relying on you two staying together in a romantic way. At the end of this debate, the conception of how people would behave and understand relationships is far better for children and the people within those relationships in a world where we only co-parent with people for whom we feel platonically.
Okay, thanks a lot for that speech. Speaking at second negative is Jeremiah. He was a DCA of the ILS Parliamentary Debate Open and was also a grand finalist and 8th best speaker at Sydney Mini. Welcome, Jeremiah.
All right. Thank you, Ellie. The problem with this team's case is that they rely on friends being sustainable partners for your child in the raising of that child. But the problem was that sometimes you saw a friend who you thought would be a long-term friend. You didn't litigate whether or not you cared about that friendship enough. And it meant that it was likely, or perhaps you were more susceptible to a breaking up in that friendship. At least with a relationship, you litigate whether or not you care about that person deeply. You want to know their deepest desires and beliefs. You want to know their dark secrets. A romantic relationship is inherently more there's more investigation that occurs there, whereas with friendships, that does not occur. There are a few things I'll talk about in this speech. Firstly, what happens to the child. Secondly, harms to the self. And thirdly, maybe I'll talk about some substantive. I don't know if it's really good yet, but we'll see. First issue on what happens to the child. They have a few things that they wanted to say. They firstly said that you can make separate decisions now between who you would love and the parent of your child. I already told you in my introduction that actually the conflation of these two decisions are actually useful because you are choosing a long-term partner, you're choosing a soulmate, you're choosing someone whose ideologies you are compatible with, you are choosing someone who thought would treat you correctly, and this is litigated heavily because every romantic relationship one enters is always going to be done for the long term, whereas friendships are just spur of the moment. You don't ask yourself, am I going to be friends with this dude for the next 3 years? And if I'm not going to, do I just not enter this friendship? No, you enter into friendships and they are spur of the moment, and it may break up in about 2 years or perhaps even 1. Therefore, it is better if you left this child and the raising of this child to a relationship where you actually put in the most amount of effort to decide whether or not that person was worth it. They might be like, oh, well, people will also litigate their friends to ensure that they are raising their child with a person who they're like raising their child with a person who they thought would be good for that child. But this is absurd because you can't assume that people are just going to make sure that all their friends are good at raising children, because some people might be 19 and they might want to have a new house might want to move out of home and get a new house. People do that on the spur of the moment. That is a massive financial decision. It is unclear why 19-year-olds who just come out of high school are not just going to raise a child like they do raise a plant and raise a pet project. It is unclear why you can ensure that people are going to necessarily choose someone who is the best partner for the raising of that child. It is likely that you're going to choose someone who you just vibed with, and this is insufficient to the raising of a child. What are the harms here? It is A, that you are easily able to break up, and those are for the reasons that I've just given you, because you did not litigate whether or not you would be a long-term relationship with this person. But B, you are more prone to bickering. And note, romantic relationships, yes, have bickering and fights, but at the very least, you want to make it work because of not just your child, but because of you. This is the person that you truly loved. When it comes to a friend, there are different levels of friends, yeah? Like there are best friends, close friends, good mates, okay mates. Maybe you're just in the middle section of the hierarchy of friends. And what if you didn't care about that relationship with that person? You were just going to move on and it was necessarily going to hurt your child. Let's turn now to what they say in substantive. Leah's just like, oh, well, children need stability. Bro, this is contingent. You need to prove that your friends are going to be stable for your children. That's all your substantive wiped out of the debate. Then they claimed that, oh, well, marriages are often really rushed and stuff like that. Well, friendships can also be really rushed. I'm not documenting with my friends oh, this new person I met on the street, I don't know if I should actually become mates with them. I don't know if I should go and see a movie with them platonically. No one litigates this kind of stuff, and friendships are probably more rushed than they are when it comes to romance. Then they claimed that, well, you will always care for a child under either side. We refuse this characterization. And the reason is because you are going to conflate your deep love with someone with your child. You deeply loved an individual. You liked the way that they looked. Leah's like, oh, well, the affirmative is like, oh, well, you just care about their facial features. Some of those things are quite endearing to you. And when you see that in your child, you are likely going to reflect on that and do whatever it took to raise them in a way that was beneficial. And yes, it is true that maybe you cared about a child, even if it is true that you didn't see your partner in that child. Yes, that's true. But let's judge this debate on comparisons. Where are you more likely going to raise your child to a really high degree? Where are you more likely going to love your child? When they reflected an individual that you cared so deeply about, who you would die for, or when they reflected someone you met at a coffee shop? Be comparative in this debate. Then they claim that, oh, well, love fades for children, the love fades, and therefore your love for your child will fade. We also refuse this characterization. There are a bunch of single parents. We don't agree that this is the case. This debate is about when you are in that relationship, and when you stay in that relationship, how will that reflect the way in which you raise that child? Then they said, oh, well, this allows a fallback of relationships because it's normalized to have raised children with different parts of people in society or different parts in your circle of relationships. 3 responses. spouses, firstly, if there's no one to fall back on, governments usually have a lot of welfare. So there's like that safety net for you. So it's okay if you can't find anyone who can help you raise a child after a breakup. But secondly, the status quo allows people to access support networks. For example, you might not have a partner to raise your child, but you have your parents who can act as grandparents and want to raise that child with you as well. And thirdly, it's not as if you can't find a new partner. So it's untrue that if your relationship fades, you will not be able to find any you won't be able to find an avenue to properly raise your child. At the conclusion of this speech, I have established that the harms that they had told you about are severely mitigated, right? Because they wanted to point some problems to us and we turn them back around on them. Additionally, at the end of this issue, I told you that it was more likely that you would elevate your love for your child and you'll do whatever it took for your child because of the characteristics that they demonstrated to you from your partner and from someone who you so deeply cared about, who was different to just a friend. Let's turn to the second issue about the harms to the self. We tell you at Shruti, which is amazing material, which is that romance becomes quite tenuous. And their response is like, yeah, it's okay if romance becomes tenuous. This is a terrible response. If you can no longer see someone who you love, it really devastates your ability to be a happy individual. Why? Because romance is a very special kind of relationship. It is spiritual, it is sexual, it is physical, and it is also emotional and mental. You can have parts of you can have those different types of relationships with different people, but usually you can't have you can't have sexual relationships with someone who you might have an emotional bond with because they might be a friend or someone of a different position where you can't establish that kind of multi-layered connection. Romance is every single connection you can think of. To have an absence of this is to have an absence of what makes you able to maximize your humanity and maximize your happiness. Romance is necessary for you to feel safe, for you to feel happy. It elevates people both internally and externally. So what happens is that if you remove romance from an individual's life, or you make romance tenuous, you make someone's happiness tenuous, and that is devastating for the raising of a child. People who are unhappy and raise children also have negative, compounding effects on that child. Children are raised in worse ways when people are unhappy. That is the reason why you should always have your child with someone you're romantically involved with.
Okay, thanks a lot for that speech. To conclude the affirmative team's case, I'd like to welcome Apratim, who is one of the leading up-and-coming names in South Asia, being the first ever debater from Nepal to both break out a major and win an international title for the country. He's also the convener of Nepal Australs and Equity at Easters. Welcome, Apratim.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Just give me a second and I'll start. Okay, wonderful. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the problem with side opposition in this debate is their failure to even conceive the world that we're giving to you in terms of how relationships would normally be. 3 key questions coming in from side proposition. First, we'll prove to you as to the first question that we answered for you is, are romantic relationships really intrinsic and important for parenting? Secondly, if they're not, then why perhaps it's better off for parents and why it's better off for kids? The only frame that they perhaps want to run in this debate with is the idea that family is extremely important for the child, and therefore these individuals are likely to stay longer, and that's perhaps better, right? We don't essentially think, this debate is really about longevity of the relationships, simply because the point at which proposition's entire case is about at what points do kids perhaps are better off protected when adult relationships potentially break down. I think that side perhaps wins the debate, because here's the thing, right? The entire analysis is that people are likely to stick together because of the fact that they're married, and that's wonderful. We tell you that under our world, when these relationships, when the kind of responsibilities for the child are separated under with 2 people who are here primarily because they want to perhaps care for the child, at that particular point of time, we're unsure as to why that longevity relationship really has to prosper. But secondly, right, we do think there are laws under our side as well that you do have under your side, meaning that on the op side, if there are divorces, it doesn't mean that the child is completely abandoned. At that particular point of time, we still do think that individuals who do come into this responsibility do have certain sort of responsibility in terms of taking care of this child and why that's better. But secondly, right, why do we think in terms it's drastically better under our world? Three responses to this. First, we think mathematically speaking, at a point at which we take away the idea of romance in terms of people coming together for relationships, they're more likely to be serious in terms of the kind of things that they look for into one another, in terms of the ideas that people look into one another, in terms like basically in terms of choosing what person is the best possible person to raise this particular child. We think at a point of time, this relationship is a lot more serious than marriage. At a point which a life is concerned, people are likely to be more serious and less people are necessarily likely to, let's say, go into relationships and stuff. At that particular point of time, we're unsure if the framing really stands, because under their world, if the characterization is true that it's so easy for people to perhaps go into, like, take moment of the spur decisions with extreme life decisions, at that particular point of time, we think on the counterfactual, it's easier for under their side for individuals to go into things like marriage, for individuals to go into things like long-term marriages basically on the spur, and we think that in itself has a lot more harm towards people. First, frame this debate that's important. Firstly, are romantic relationships intrinsically important of parenting? What do we tell you? In first speech, we told you that it's perhaps not necessarily extremely necessary, because individuals still essentially do care about the child, because A, we think that there exists a responsibility from these individuals in terms of why they perhaps want to care for the child. But secondly, because these individuals are like extensions of self-identity and stuff, right? Meaning the care that this child perhaps deserves in most cases will be there because these individuals themselves, A, have taken decisions in terms of who perhaps they want to go with, but secondly, are responsible for these childs a lot more. But secondly, we think at a point at which necessarily the premise of this relationship is essentially love, which is based upon either idealistic notion of what love is, which we think is incompatible with, let's say, things that a child needs, like economic optimization or compromises, but secondly, is based upon traits that fade away over time. At that particular point of time, we think we possibly can do away with the harms that it may accrue. The response to this particular argument is saying that separation necessarily doesn't happen in all cases. Three responses to that. Firstly, our argument isn't contingent on the idea that separation will happen. It is contingent on the idea that at a point at which there is a risk in the kind of conceptions of family that exists right now in terms of romantic associations, at that particular point of time, the risk of separation in itself is too risky for this child to perhaps be subjected towards it, even in the best case if the child perhaps isn't necessarily goes through a family that goes under separation. But secondly, right, we don't essentially, we think that there isn't necessarily 100% chance of most things happening under our world, right? But there are still possibly laws, there are possibly things to protect you against it. At a point in which we think it's something so serious as a child's life in terms of where a child has to go forward, we think the best possible thing to do here is to probably take away the idea of romantic notions away from this and to focus more upon the idea of child and centering the child in the relationship itself so that the child is best possible cared for and the individuals themselves can perhaps look for their happiness elsewhere in terms of what perhaps suits them better, but now not are stuck with individuals who didn't consent to be in the first place. But the second idea, in terms of what's perhaps better for partners, right? We give you three key impacts here, none of which they respond. Firstly, we tell you as to why perhaps it's a better process in terms of choosing the person that you marry, in terms of why this is a better decision-making process. Their only response to this is that comes from the first opposition is for them to say that at a point that you probably are likely to take better decisions at a point at which you compound these things. And the only reasoning behind that was to say that because individuals are likely to choose other people who they perhaps like sync with or who they value, who they like decision, who they value systems match with, right? We think that's exactly the problem. That is, at the point at which you're going to a relationship with a certain person or you're going to marry a certain person, you look towards and you prioritize the ideas of who you perhaps going to have good conversations with or who are going to tune better, not necessarily who's going to be a better father or better mother. We think that's a much broader discussion that needs a separate idea or needs a separate perhaps platform for you to discuss that. At the point at which we give that to you, we take that particular idea, right? But the second idea that comes from them, right, that they tell you that it's perhaps like you basically can move into like at any particular point of time with any particular person, that's going to be easier. We've already told you it's a much bigger decision for you to make. We think at a point at which that's a much bigger responsibility for you to make. We think the only individuals who probably will go into this in terms of making that decisions are individuals who perhaps are looking towards looking towards having a child together. At a point at which these individuals aren't forced because of social conceptions of when you're supposed to have a child, but secondly, the social conceptions of you perhaps are married, now you're supposed to have a child, or you're 28 because of which you're supposed to have a child. At that particular point of time, we think it's much easier for these individuals to perhaps make this particular decision. But secondly, we told you that we give you much less, let's say, rush pregnancies and marriages, as to why that's perhaps going to be better, because you aren't pushed into society a lot more. The response to that in this particular clash is for them to say that you are likely, let's say, to be unhappy under our world because there's a third person involved. One, we clearly tell you in our world what the conception of, let's say, toxicity stems from as to how they currently perceive monogamous relationship. We think that in itself is perhaps that's something that Leah has extensively elaborated upon as to why that's not there. But second, more importantly, right, at a point at which these responsibilities are separate, we think that you can focus on individual relationships a lot better, where you can focus upon maintaining, let's say, a fulfilling, much more happy relationships in terms of like romantic relationship with one individual. But secondly, we think you're also able to then prioritize and probably focus upon the child rearing as you divert responsibilities. We think that at the point which you compound both of them together, it becomes increasingly difficult for you to do this. But thirdly, we told you it's easier for you to leave people who make you unhappy. They tell you and give you a host of reasons as to why family stays together. We ask, why is that important? Because if people are unhappy to be together and still are forced to stay together, we think that there are multiple harms coming down to kids that you perhaps don't necessarily want to accrue in terms of basically impacting the kids. But lastly, right, what's better for kids? We're able to tell you under our side that at the point at which essentially the idea of relationships and the idea of family under our world isn't necessarily based upon the idea of what you perhaps have to do for the broader family or what you perhaps have to do for the relationship. Under that scenario, at the point at which the child becomes a pivot of your relationship with a second person, where the child is the main focus, you're better able to evaluate your decisions in terms of parenting, in terms of what you perhaps want to do that's best for the child. We think that in itself is the best possible world, because there are multiple facets that affect you in the current world when you're currently making decisions, right? We think it's pretty simple in terms of how women make decisions in terms of, let's say, staying at home, because the fact that they believe that it's easier for the child if they perhaps do so, but in more, the reason that they do so in most cases is because societal notions, but second, more importantly, they do so because they're weighing in other calculus, for example, like the family, their husband and all. We think at a point at which your focus is the child in itself, we think you're better able to make decisions that suit them better. But more importantly, we think that like the people who are raising the child are happier, which means that the child is having, let's say, more care, more love, more attention. We think that the child is essentially raised in a better environment. And third, and more importantly, at a point at which we don't think it's intrinsically important that this relationship is there for the child, we outweighed all the harms that they've given you. We're proud to propose.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. To conclude the debate, I'd like to welcome Jess, who's convening this tournament. She describes herself as being known for cringe polls and pop posting, pushing the boundaries of acceptable retirement ages, and being silly enough to Adjudicator WUDC for a second time. However, she has a pretty impressive list of achievements, including having won Australs in 2017 and DCAing it in 2018. Welcome, Jess.
Cool. I'm going to assume that I'm audible, and if so, start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Affirmative kind of have one central push in this debate, which is everything we're describing, well, that would have changed. People would have adapted. The problem is you cannot adapt to what is innate in human nature, which is that when you have multiple different interests that need to be reconciled, it is very difficult to do so. So if you have one primary romantic partner in which you fulfill that side of things, but then you also have a partner in which you are attempting to raise a child, I just posit, and this has been central throughout our case, that it becomes difficult to do that. And in actual fact, you get more volatility that results in worse harms for children. And those should be the most primary things we consider in this debate, because maybe affirmative can prove that you get slightly more choice in relationships, but I think this is just vastly less significant than if children have to face more instability in the way that they go about their lives. I'm going to ask 3 questions. Firstly, what is best for children? Secondly, what is best for your choices? And then some very minor issues around like women and other things which I just think are quite symmetric in this debate. Okay, firstly, let's look at children. I want to start with the clash around the point in which you're entering and deciding the relationships that you have. Because affirmative's main claim here is that now you can separate the qualities. You can look at someone in which you would like to, for example, have a romantic relationship with, and you can separately, for example, look at someone you'd like to raise a child with. And you can just pick the best qualities from both. And they also characterize that sometimes you're blinded by romantic considerations, and that doesn't necessarily always make for the best parent who can raise a child. We have a number of responses to this throughout our case. The first thing is just to say, as I've kind of already flagged, it is just very difficult sometimes to separate those two things. So I would just posit a practical constraint, that is that you cannot do so fully at the point where those people, like your romantic partner and your child-rearing partner, let's say, they're going to have to interact at some point. You cannot just keep those lives completely separate. So already this is a very difficult practicality. Secondly, I would just reject the assumption that people are so silly that they just like enter into relationships because they just think someone is hot and then like, oh shit, I've had a kid with them. That's like not how human decision making actually works. And I do think people are a little bit more discerning than this. Thirdly, though, as we explained, and I just think this gets insufficient response, the fact that you generally then have to satisfy both things, the person would have to be someone that you would envisage probably having children with in the future, and also that they satisfy your desire to have a romantic relationship, if that's something that you want, means that there's like a much higher burden for entering into relationships. And that is good because you want someone who can fulfill the qualities of potentially being a parent, but also is likely to make you happy in a way that makes you fulfilled and makes you a better parent. But I think that the final thing to say is just that I think that their claim rests upon an assumption that there's just like not enough people out there, and like it's very difficult to find someone that you could possibly be a good parent and also be a good romantic partner. I would just posit that it's probably possible to have both. So just because numerically you might have more choice doesn't mean that the choices that you don't already have in the current world are not already sufficient. We would say that they are. The next point, though, under this clash of children is the idea around like stability then after you've made the choice, after you've entered into the relationship. Because AF's main claim here is just to say that, well, you know, romantic relationships can end poorly when they become unstable. That means that, you know, parents get divorced, for example, and that's bad for children. Sure, that happens. Romantic relationships are, of course, not always stable, but this debate has to be comparative. We gave you a number of reasons as to why, on balance, relationships that are non-romantic primarily are more likely to be unstable for children. The first reason for that is because there's one less thing that is tethering you to that situation. That is your romantic love. And they say in response that, you care for your child though, so you won't leave. Yes, that's true, but that is symmetric. We're just saying that this is one additional thing that tethers you to that situation. Their response to that is then to say that, but it's bad because you're pressuring people to stay together. I do not think that the harm manifests exactly in the most harmful way that they suggest, which is that I don't think this norm necessarily forces people to stay in relationships where they are desperately unhappy. But I think it's fine if there is some additional pressure that means like, you know, hey, you know, you should carefully think this through. And if your romantic consideration is informing that, I just do not think that's the worst thing in the world. But we also explained that love is an additional form of support that can be very, very useful in this scenario. Maybe you're getting some love in another scenario, but like that's not necessarily guaranteed. This ensures that both things necessarily intertwine, and that the love and support that you get is directly correlated. Oh, fuck off Discord, seriously, with, you know, with that relationship. We also posit that there's more likely to be legal protections, and I just think as well there is more instability at the point where there are more variables. Like when you've got, instead of two people's interests you have to reconcile, under their world you potentially have to reconcile many more parties' interests, because person is dating that person who's raising a child with that person. There's more potential for instability to result. And again, their main claim is adaptability in response, but you don't overcome human, you know, innate desires, which is that people, when they have different interests that have to be reconciled, often do result in instability. The final point under children is just around like, there's two more points under children. They say that now you have more people to fall back on. One, that's not necessarily true, because the people you're relying to fall back on did not consent to be necessarily involved in that child rearing context. But as Jerry explains, there is just like, this is, again, if true, somewhat symmetric. There are other relationships that you can fall back on in society. In our world, grandparents, you can get support from the state, you can move on to a new partner. I just do not think this is a particularly significant benefit, even if it is true. They finally say that your love for your child might fade because you've tied it to the idea of the romantic partner. I do not think this is true. We've already responded to this to say that your love for your child is likely to stay no matter what. Let's look at some far less significant questions now, because I just think all of that just suggests that things will be much more stable for the child. They are obviously a far more vulnerable stakeholder in this debate. Even if they can prove that things are slightly better for other relationships, we just do not care. This is far less significant. But let's answer the point around whether relationships are more free. I would make a couple observations. The first is just that the evolving norms that we have in society under the status quo suggest that people in general have more and more choices about who they can be in relationships, whether that's, for example, evolving norms around polygamous relationships and so on. But I would also suggest this is actually not more choice, in the sense that at the point, again, where you have to reconcile so many different relationships, you have to make sure that your child-rearing partner is probably cool with your romantic partner and those sorts of things. I don't necessarily think means you actually do have more choice. And again, if you do, this is just less important. Okay, the final thing in this debate is just like a few miscellaneous harms around women. They say that now there's less pressure on women, their biological clock is ticking and so on. I'm just not really sure how this changes, given that there'll probably still be expectations from grandparents who want to have lineage. They want their, their daughter to have a child. There's, norms that exist in the media. I just don't think you get much change on this at all. As for rush pregnancies, like presumably people are still going to have unprotected sex. There's still going to be incentives surrounding that. So at the end of the day, even if you believe that a little bit, it is likely to be very marginal. But again, far, far less important than the question of stability. We ensure that children are raised in environments that are far more stable for them. That is the most important question in this debate, one in which we win. So Neg win. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot to Jess, and thanks to all speakers for a really great debate. So that concludes the Easter's demo debate. I hope that this has been informative for the audience. I'm sure that there are a lot of things in all of those great speeches that you can learn from and hopefully bring to the next couple of days of debating. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Ellie, for chairing. We appreciate it. Thanks,
No worries.
everyone. I attempt to stop live streaming now.